They drove past her like she was invisible, until the man everyone else ignored turned back into the storm. The wind howled across the empty highway, rain slamming sideways in sheets so thick it blurred the world into gray chaos, and somewhere between mile marker 42 and nowhere, Ava Sinclair stood beside her stalled SUV, heels sinking into the soaked gravel, her phone dead, her breath sharp with frustration she refused to show. Cars had passed, headlights cutting through the storm, slowing just enough to see her, to judge her, and then accelerating again as if helping wasn't worth the trouble. And then there was him, a man in a worn jacket, boots darkened by rain, a figure that didn't belong to her world, who had already walked past once, unnoticed, dismissed without a second thought, until something in him paused, shifted, and turned back against the wind. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice steady, almost swallowed by the storm, and Ava straightened, brushing wet strands of hair from her face, her eyes sharp, guarded, the kind of look that had closed billion-dollar deals and shut down men twice his size. "I'm fine," she replied quickly, too quickly, as thunder rolled low across the sky, and he studied the dead vehicle, the flicker of hazard lights fading into nothing, the long stretch of empty road with no shelter in sight. The rain hit harder, colder now, soaking through fabric, seeping into bone, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them filled with something heavier than weather. Judgment, distance, two lives that should never have crossed. He nodded once, like a man accepting an answer he didn't believe, and turned as if to leave, boots crunching against wet gravel, disappearing back into the storm the same way he came, unnoticed, unimportant, just another shadow in a world that had already decided who mattered and who didn't. Ava watched him go, jaw tightening, pride holding firm even as the cold crept in, even as the wind seemed to strip away every layer of control she was used to commanding. And then the storm surged again, louder, sharper, a gust that nearly knocked her off balance, forcing her hand against the side of the SUV just to stay upright, and something shifted, not in the sky but in the quiet place where certainty lived. Behind her, footsteps returned, slower this time, deliberate, and she turned just as he stepped back into view. Rain dripping from his sleeves, eyes calm in a way that didn't match the chaos around them. "There's a cabin about a quarter-mile up," he said simply, no insistence, no pressure, just fact, and she hesitated, her world built on control, on knowing exactly who she was dealing with, on never needing help from a stranger who looked like he had nothing to offer. "I don't need," she started, voice firm, but the words caught as the wind cut through again, colder now, unforgiving, and he didn't interrupt, didn't argue, just stood there, waiting, like a man who understood that some decisions had to be made in silence. "It's your call," he added, already turning away, already ready to disappear again, and that was the moment it broke. Not her strength, not her pride, but the illusion that she was still in control. "Wait," she said, quieter this time, the word almost lost in the storm, but he heard it, stopping without turning, and for the first time that night Ava Sinclair, though strategist, the woman who never needed anyone, took a step toward a man she didn't understand, into a choice that would hit harder than the rain ever could. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell. It really helps the channel and means a lot to us. Now let's go on. The gravel path was barely visible under the pounding rain as Ava followed a few steps behind him, her heels slipping, her breath uneven not from fear but from something unfamiliar, something quieter, like the slow realization that control was not something you could command from a boardroom when the world decided otherwise. He did not look back to check on her, not out of indifference, but out of a kind of respect that did not assume weakness, and that unsettled her more than the storm ever could. "How far?" she asked, her voice sharper than necessary, cutting through the wind as if tone alone could restore order, and he answered without turning. "About a quarter-mile. Maybe less." Steady, measured, like distance was not something to be exaggerated for comfort or minimized for pride. The road narrowed into a dirt trail, bordered by tall pines that swayed and creaked, their branches whispering against each other like old voices sharing secrets, and the smell of wet earth rose with every step, grounding the moment in something real, something far removed from glass towers and polished marble floors. Ava pulled her coat tighter, though it did little against the cold now settling deep into her shoulders, and she watched him more carefully, the way he moved without hesitation, the way he adjusted his pace just slightly when the path became uneven, not slowing down for her, but making it easier for someone behind him to keep up, and that detail did not go unnoticed. "You do this often?" she pressed, needing information, needing a frame, needing to understand the kind of man who would turn back into a storm for a stranger, and he gave a small shake of his head, rain dripping from his hairline. No, he said simply, and that was it. No explanation, no story, just a boundary she could not easily cross. They reached the cabin just as a low rumble of thunder rolled across the sky again, closer now, deeper, and he stepped onto the small wooden porch, pushing the door open with a quiet creak that seemed almost swallowed by the storm behind them. Inside, the air was still dim, carrying the faint scent of old wood and something warmer, something steady, and he moved with quiet familiarity, striking a match and lighting a small lantern, the flame flickering to life, casting soft shadows across the walls. Ava stepped in slowly, water dripping from the hem of her coat, her eyes adjusting to the low light, taking in the simplicity of the space, a small table, 2 chairs, a worn couch, and a fireplace that looked like it had not been used in a while. And for a moment she said nothing, because there was nothing in this room that matched her world, and yet it did not feel lacking, it felt intentional. You live here? She asked, her voice softer now, less guarded, and he paused only briefly before answering. Sometimes, before moving toward the fireplace, kneeling to stack a few pieces of wood with practiced ease. She watched him, studying the quiet precision in his movements, the way he worked without rush, without show, and something in her posture shifted, just slightly, as if the storm outside had begun to move inward, not as chaos but as clarity. You do not even know who I am, she said after a moment, testing him, offering the kind of statement that usually demanded attention, recognition, reaction, and he struck the match again, the flame catching the edge of the wood as he replied without looking up. I know enough. Calm, grounded, like identity was not something he measured in titles. The fire began to take, small at first, then stronger, light spreading across the room in warm pulses, and Ava stood there, rain-soaked, silent, realizing for the first time that the man she had almost dismissed on the side of the road was the only reason she was not still standing in that storm, and the only person in the room who did not seem to care who she was. The fire settled into a steady rhythm, soft crackles filling the cabin as warmth slowly pushed back against the cold that clung to Ava's skin, and for the first time since the storm began, there was stillness, not the kind that came from control, but the kind that came from surrender. She stood near the doorway a moment longer, unsure where to place herself in a room that did not operate by the rules she understood, while he moved quietly, pulling a folded blanket from the back of the worn couch and setting it within her reach without a word. You should dry off, he said simply, his tone even, not instructing, not assuming, just offering, and she hesitated before taking it, the fabric rough but warm, a small comfort that felt larger than it should have. Thank you, she said, the words unfamiliar on her tongue in this context, quieter than anything she had said all night, and he nodded once, already turning away as if gratitude was not something he needed to receive. The lantern light flickered gently, casting long shadows that moved with the fire, and Ava wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, sitting carefully at the edge of the couch, her posture still composed, still guarded, but less rigid than before, as if the storm had taken something from her and left something else behind. She watched him as he poured water from a metal kettle into 2 plain mugs, the faint sound of steam rising, the simple act carried out with a kind of quiet focus that made it feel deliberate, meaningful. There is no cell service out here, is there? She asked, already knowing the answer but needing to confirm, needing to understand the boundaries of this place, and he handed her one of the mugs before responding, not for miles. His voice calm, matter of fact, and she let out a small breath she did not realize she had been holding, the last thread of her usual world slipping just a little further away. The tea was warm, slightly bitter, grounding, and she held it between her hands as if anchoring herself to something real, something immediate, while the storm continued to rage outside, wind pressing against the cabin walls like a reminder that the world beyond was still wild, still uncontrollable. You are very calm for someone in the middle of all this, she said after a moment, her eyes lifting to him, studying him more closely now, searching for something beneath the surface, and he leaned back against the wooden wall, arms relaxed, gaze steady. Storms pass, he replied, simple, almost obvious, yet the way he said it carried something deeper, something that was not just about weather. She tilted her head slightly, considering him, her mind trying to place him within a category that made sense, but nothing fit, not the way he spoke, not the way he carried himself, not the way he seemed completely unaffected by the tension that would have unsettled anyone else. What do you do? She asked, the question more direct now, her instinct to define, to understand, to label returning, and for a brief moment, He was silent, not evasive, not defensive, just choosing his answer. Carefully. I take care of what is in front of me, he said finally, his eyes meeting hers without hesitation, and something about that answer unsettled her more than any silence could have, because it did not give her anything to measure, nothing to quantify, nothing to control. The firelight reflected in her eyes as she looked at him, really looked this time, noticing the small details she had missed before, the steadiness in his posture, the absence of urgency, the quiet confidence that did not need to prove itself, and for the first time that night Ava Sinclair found herself without a response, sitting in a cabin miles away from everything she knew, across from a man who refused to fit into any world she understood, and realizing that whatever she thought strength looked like before this storm, it did not look like this. The fire burned steadier now, its glow softening the sharp edges of the room, but the tension between them had not disappeared. It had simply changed shape, quieter, more deliberate, like something waiting to be understood rather than confronted. Ava shifted slightly on the couch, the blanket wrapped closer around her shoulders, her eyes no longer scanning the room but returning to him again and again, as if the answers she was used to finding in data and reports might somehow be written into the way he stood, the way he breathed, the way he seemed completely unbothered by her presence and yet entirely aware of it. You speak like someone who has lost something, she said suddenly, the words coming out more direct than she intended, cutting through the quiet with a precision she could not quite control, and for a moment the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the low hum of wind pressing against the cabin walls. He did not react immediately, did not deflect or correct her, just let the question exist between them like a weight that did not need to be lifted right away. Everyone loses something, he answered after a pause, his voice even, not distant, but not inviting further either, and she narrowed her eyes slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition of a boundary she was not used to encountering. Ava leaned forward just enough to set the mug down on the small wooden table, her movements controlled, deliberate, but there was a subtle shift now, a curiosity that had begun to replace the guarded skepticism she carried in with her. That is not an answer, she said, her tone softer but still firm, and he gave the smallest hint of a smile, not amused, not dismissive, just acknowledging the truth of it without offering more. Outside, the storm surged again, a sudden gust rattling the windows, and Ava instinctively glanced toward the sound before looking back at him, as if expecting him to respond, to act, to do something, but he remained still, grounded, like the storm was something external, something separate from whatever anchored him in place. You do not ask questions, she continued, her voice quieter now, more thoughtful. Most people would have asked who I am by now, and this time he met her gaze directly, not challenging, not curious, just present. Would it change anything? He asked, and the question landed differently than she expected, not as a test, not as defiance, but as something honest, something that did not need to be complicated. She opened her mouth to respond, then stopped, the answer forming and dissolving at the same time, because in her world, identity was everything. It defined power, access, influence, and yet here in this small cabin, it seemed to carry no weight at all. Yes, she said finally, though her voice lacked the certainty it usually held, and he tilted his head slightly, considering her answer with the same calm attention he had given everything else. How? He asked, not challenging her, not dismissing her, just asking, and that was the moment something shifted again, not in the room, not in the storm, but in her, because she realized she did not have a simple answer, not one that made sense here, not one that held the same authority it always had. The fire popped softly, sending a brief spark upward before settling again, and Ava leaned back slowly, her posture no longer as rigid, her mind turning inward in a way it rarely allowed itself to do. You are different, she said after a long pause, not as a compliment, not as an accusation, just as a statement of fact, and he gave a small nod, accepting the observation without claiming it. So are you, he replied, and for the first time there was no edge in her response, no need to correct or define, just a quiet acknowledgement of something. She was only beginning to understand, sitting across from a man who had not once asked for her name, her status or her story, and yet had seen more of her in a single night than most people ever had. The storm outside did not ease, but inside the cabin, something steadier had taken its place, something quieter than comfort and deeper than coincidence, and Ava found herself watching him not with suspicion now, but with a kind of attention she had not given anyone in a long time. He moved toward a small shelf near the wall, pulling down a dry flannel shirt and setting it gently on the arm of the couch beside her without a word, and she glanced at it, then at him, her instinct to refuse rising. Out of habit more than necessity. I will be fine, she said, her tone measured, controlled, but lacking the edge it carried before, and he nodded once, not insisting, not correcting, just accepting her answer as it was, though the quiet look in his eyes suggested he had already considered the outcome beyond her words. The fire warmed the room further, softening the chill that had settled into her bones, and the sound of rain against the roof became less aggressive, more rhythmic, like a distant reminder rather than an immediate threat. Ava shifted again, her fingers tracing the rim of the mug she had set down, her thoughts no longer racing ahead to the next decision, the next command, but lingering here, in a moment she could not control and did not fully understand. You do not seem curious, she said after a while, her voice quieter, less defensive, more reflective, and he glanced toward her briefly before returning his attention to the fire, adjusting a piece of wood so it caught the flame more evenly. About what? He asked, simple, open, and she exhaled slowly, choosing her words more carefully now. About me, she said, and the statement hung in the air, not as a challenge, but as an observation she was still trying to process herself. He considered it for a moment, the firelight flickering across his face, revealing lines of experience that spoke without explanation, and then he answered, You told me enough when you said you were fine in the middle of a storm. His tone calm. Not critical, just honest, and something in that response settled deeper than she expected. Ava looked down briefly, her reflection faintly visible in the surface of the cooling tea, and for a moment, she saw not the composed executive she presented to the world, but the version of herself that had stood alone on a dark road, refusing help because it did not come in a form she trusted. People rely on me, she said, almost to herself, the words quieter now, stripped of their usual authority, and he did not interrupt, did not offer reassurance or contradiction, just listened in a way that made the silence feel like space rather than absence. If I do not hold things together, everything falls apart, she added, her voice steady but softer than before, and he leaned back slightly, his gaze thoughtful, not dismissing her belief, but not fully accepting it either. That sounds heavy, he said, and there was no judgment in it, no attempt to fix or reframe, just acknowledgement, and that alone made her pause. Ava let out a small breath, the tension in her shoulders easing just enough to be noticed, and she reached for the flannel shirt this time without speaking, the gesture quiet, almost unconscious, as if something in her had already decided before her mind caught up. He noticed but said nothing, turning his attention back to the fire as she stepped just out of the direct light to change, the fabric warm against her skin, grounding in a way she had not expected. When she returned to the couch, wrapped in the borrowed shirt and the blanket, she felt different, not transformed, not undone but shifted, like something rigid had softened just enough to bend without breaking. You help people without asking anything in return, she said after a long pause, her voice steady, more certain now, and he met her gaze again, his expression unchanged, calm, present. Sometimes that is what they need, he replied, and she held his gaze a moment longer, searching for something more, some hidden motive, some explanation that fit her understanding of how the world worked. But there was nothing there except a quiet certainty she could not argue with, sitting in a small cabin miles away from everything she knew, realizing that the man in front of her had done more for her in a single night than most people in her world ever would, and he had done it without ever asking who she was. The fire had settled into a low, steady glow, casting a quiet warmth that softened the edges of everything in the room, and for a while neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence itself had begun to feel like something worth keeping. Ava sat deeper into the couch now, the oversized flannel sleeves covering part of her hands, her posture no longer rigid but not entirely relaxed either, caught somewhere between who she had been before the storm and who she was becoming inside it. The rain outside had shifted from violent to persistent, a steady rhythm against the roof, like the world had stopped shouting and started listening, and she found herself watching the fire instead of watching him, her thoughts moving slower, more deliberate, as if each one needed to be examined before it could exist. You are not what you seem, she said quietly, not looking at him this time, the words more observation than accusation, and for a moment he did not answer, the crackle of wood filling the space between them. Neither are you, he replied after a beat, his tone unchanged, steady, as if the truth did not require emphasis, and she let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. People always think they know what I am, she said, her voice softer now, less guarded, and he shifted slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, his gaze thoughtful but not intrusive. Do they? He asked, and she nodded once, her eyes still on the fire. They see the position, the decisions, the results. They assume that is the whole story, she said, and the words came easier now, not because she wanted to explain herself, but because for the first time she was not being interrupted or redirected. He studied her for a moment, not evaluating, not judging, just listening in a way that felt unfamiliar and disarming. And is it? He asked, and she shook her head slightly, almost immediately, the answer coming before. She could filter it. No, she admitted, and the word lingered, heavier than it should have been. The wind outside brushed against the cabin again, softer now, like a reminder that it was still there, still moving, even if it no longer demanded attention. And Ava finally looked up at him, her eyes searching, not for answers this time but for understanding. You said you take care of what is in front of you, she continued, her tone measured, curious now rather than defensive. That is not how most people live. And he gave a small nod, acknowledging the truth of that without needing to defend it. Most people are busy holding on to what is behind them or worrying about what is ahead, he said, his voice calm, grounded, and something in that landed differently. Not as advice, not as correction, but as something she recognized in herself without wanting to. She leaned back slightly, the blanket shifting around her, and for a moment she closed her eyes just for a second, as if testing what it felt like to not think about the next move, the next decision, the next outcome. When she opened them again, he was watching the fire, not her, giving her that space without making it feel like distance. You have done this before, she said suddenly, the thought forming clearly now, her gaze sharpening just a little. Not the storm but this way of being. And this time he did not answer right away, the pause longer, more deliberate, and she noticed it, the way he chose his silence as carefully as his words. I have learned a few things, he said finally, simple, restrained, and she tilted her head slightly, studying him again, the pieces beginning to form a picture she could not fully see yet. From what? She asked, and there it was, the question that mattered, the one that would usually unlock everything. But he did not give it to her, not fully. From what I could not control, he replied, his eyes lifting to meet hers, steady, unguarded, and for a moment the room felt even quieter than before, as if the fire itself had paused to listen. Ava held his gaze, something in her expression shifting again, not confusion this time but recognition, the kind that did not come from shared experience but from shared truth, and she realized then that whatever this man had been before she met him, whatever life he had lived, it was not small, it was not simple, and it was not something she could measure with the tools she had always relied on, and for the first time that night she did not try to define it, she just let it exist. The storm began to loosen its grip sometime in the early hours, not with a sudden stop but with a quiet retreat, like something powerful choosing to step back instead of fight, and Ava noticed it before she fully opened her eyes, the absence of that relentless pounding against the roof, the way the air inside the cabin felt different, lighter, as if the night had finally exhaled. She sat up slowly, the borrowed flannel still wrapped around her, the fire reduced to glowing embers, casting a faint orange light that barely reached the corners of the room. For a moment she did not move, just listened, the silence now more present than the storm had ever been. And then she heard it, distant at first, low and rhythmic, something that did not belong to the woods or the wind. She stood, pulling the blanket around her shoulders as she stepped toward the small window, her fingers brushing aside the edge of the curtain, and there it was, far beyond the tree line, the faint outline of movement, headlights cutting through the thinning mist, more than one, steady, organized, deliberate. Her expression shifted, not in relief but in recognition, the world she belonged to finding its way back to her, even here. Behind her he was already awake, though she had not heard him rise, his presence quiet as ever, and he did not rush to the window, did not ask what she saw, just stood near the fire, watching her instead. They found me, she said, her voice steady, composed again, the familiar tone returning like a well-practiced instinct, and he gave a small nod, as if that had always been inevitable. The sound grew louder now, engines approaching, tires pressing against wet earth, and then another layer sharper, cutting through the calm, the distant hum of rotor blades, unmistakable, controlled, closing in. Ava turned, slightly looking at him now, really looking, as if seeing him through a different lens than before, one shaped not by assumption, but by everything that had happened in the space of a single night. I should go, she said, though there was something in her voice that hesitated, something that did not match the certainty of her words, and he nodded again, simple, accepting, as if departures were not something he needed to hold on to. The vehicles came to a stop just beyond the cabin, doors opening, voices calling out, organized, urgent but restrained, and for a brief second, Ava remained where she was, caught between two worlds, one defined by power, structure and expectation, the other by something quieter, something she had not yet found a name for. She stepped toward the door, then paused, her hand resting lightly on the handle, and she turned back. "You never asked my name," she said, not as a complaint, not even as a question, just a statement that carried more weight now than it would have hours ago. He met her gaze, calm, steady, and there was no curiosity in his eyes, only presence. "You did not need to tell me," he replied, and she held that for a moment, the simplicity of it, the quiet certainty that had defined everything he had done. Outside, one of the voices called again, closer now, using a name she had not spoken in this room, a name that carried authority, expectation, identity, and for the first time, it sounded different to her, heavier, louder than it needed to be. Ava opened the door, cool morning air brushing against her face, the sky still gray but clearing, and as she stepped out onto the porch, the world she knew surged forward to meet her, but behind her, in the quiet of the cabin, something stayed, something she knew would not leave as easily as the storm had. The moment Ava stepped off the porch, the quiet dissolved into motion, doors opening in quick succession, men in dark jackets moving with controlled urgency, their eyes scanning, their voices low but precise, and then one of them reached her first, relief flashing across his face before discipline pulled it back into place. "Ma'am, we have been trying to locate you for hours," he said, his tone respectful but strained, and Ava gave a small nod, her posture already shifting, shoulders straightening, presence sharpening, the version of herself the world recognized stepping forward without hesitation. "I am fine," she replied, calm, composed, as if the night had been nothing more than an inconvenience, and yet her eyes flickered once, just briefly, back toward the cabin behind her. The vehicles lined the narrow clearing now, black SUVs idling in quiet formation, and above them, the helicopter hovered at a controlled distance, its blades slicing through the morning air with steady precision, not loud enough to overwhelm, but present enough to remind everyone exactly who she was. Another man approached, holding a tablet, speaking quickly about schedules, missed calls, urgent matters that needed her attention, and Ava listened, her expression focused, absorbing information the way she always had, efficiently, without emotion, but something in her gaze was different, softer at the edges, like the storm had left behind something she could not quite put into words. "The board is requesting an immediate update," the man continued, and she nodded once, already processing, already moving forward, but then she raised a hand slightly, stopping him mid-sentence, a small gesture that carried authority without force. "In a moment," she said, her voice even, and he fell silent immediately. She turned then, fully this time looking back at the cabin, at the man who had not stepped outside, who had not followed her into the world that had come rushing back, who remained exactly where she had left him, as if nothing had changed at all. Ava walked back up the few wooden steps, the movement deliberate, slower than before, and when she reached the doorway she paused, her hand resting lightly against the frame. He was standing near the fire again, now reduced to faint embers, the room behind him quiet, unchanged, untouched by the presence of power waiting just beyond the trees. "They are here for me," she said, though it was obvious, though it did not need to be said, and he gave a small nod, acknowledging it without comment. She stepped inside one more time, the warmth of the cabin still lingering, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence returning, familiar now, grounding in a way the outside world could not replicate. "I owe you more than a thank you," she said finally, her voice steady but carrying something deeper, something sincere, and she reached into the pocket of the coat someone had placed around her shoulders, pulling out a sleek card, the kind that opened doors, that changed lives, that solved problems before they even existed. "If you ever need anything, anything at all, you call this number," she continued, placing it gently on the small table between them, the gesture practiced, natural, the way she had always repaid value with opportunity. He looked at the card, then at her, his expression unchanged, not impressed, not dismissive, just present, and for a brief second she expected something, a reaction, a shift, a recognition of what she was offering, but it did not come. "You do not owe me," he said quietly, and the words landed with more weight than anything she had heard all morning. Ava held his gaze, something tightening in her chest, not discomfort, not resistance, but something closer to understanding, something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. Maybe not, she replied softly, but I still want to. And for a moment the world outside faded again, the engines, the voices, the expectations, all of it held at a distance by the quiet dignity of the man in front of her, and she realized then that what she was offering him was not the same as what he had given her, and for the first time in a very long time she was not sure which one mattered more. For a moment neither of them moved, the card resting on the table like a bridge between two worlds that did not quite meet, and the quiet inside the cabin held stronger than the noise waiting outside. He looked at it again, not with hesitation, not with temptation, but with a kind of understanding that did not require acceptance, and then he stepped forward, closing the small distance between them with the same calm certainty he had carried through the entire night. You already gave what was needed, he said, his voice steady, not rejecting her, not dismissing her, but placing her offer into a space where it no longer held power. And Ava felt that shift more than she expected, not as resistance but as something she could not negotiate, could not influence, could not redefine. She glanced down at the card, then back at him, her expression no longer guarded, no longer controlled in the way it had been before, but open in a quiet, unfamiliar way, as if something inside her had stopped trying to lead the moment and had chosen instead to understand it. That is not how this usually works, she said softly, not as a challenge, but as a realization spoken out loud, and he gave a slight nod, acknowledging the truth of her world without stepping into it. I know, he replied, and there was no judgment in his tone, no distance, just clarity. Outside, a voice called again, closer now, reminding her that time was moving, that decisions were expected, that the version of herself she had always been was waiting to take over, and Ava exhaled slowly, her gaze lingering on him just a second longer than necessary, as if committing something to memory that could not be measured or replaced. She reached down, picking up the card from the table, her fingers brushing over its smooth surface, and for a brief moment she hesitated, the gesture small, almost invisible, but real, and then she slipped it back into her pocket without another word, the offer withdrawn not out of pride but out of understanding. You did not even ask my name, she said again, but this time there was no expectation behind it, only reflection, and he met her gaze one last time, calm, grounded, unchanged by everything that had passed between them. I did not need to, he said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything she could have offered in return. Ava nodded slowly, the movement deliberate, as if accepting something deeper than the moment itself, and then she turned, stepping out of the cabin and into the morning that had returned to claim her. The air was cooler now, the storm reduced to distant clouds drifting apart, and the line of vehicles, the waiting team, the hovering helicopter all stood ready. Organized, precise, a world built on action and control, and she walked toward it without hesitation, her posture steady, her presence unmistakable, yet something in her pace had changed, something quieter, less urgent, as if the need to prove had been replaced by the choice to simply be. She paused once more at the edge of the clearing, just before stepping fully back into that world, and she turned slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to see the cabin one last time, standing still among the trees, unchanged, untouched, holding a kind of quiet dignity that did not require recognition. Then she stepped forward, the doors opened, voices resumed, the day began, and everything moved again as it always did, but somewhere between the storm and the morning, between the silence and the truth, something had shifted in a way no title, no power, no success could ever fully explain, and in the quiet space he never left, the man who asked nothing had given her something she could not return, leaving behind not a debt, but a silence that stayed long after she was gone. In one of the most touching stories, a single dad meets a female CEO during a violent storm, and what begins as a simple act of kindness unfolds into one of the most unforgettable touching stories about dignity, humility, and human connection. As the single dad offers shelter without asking questions, the female CEO is forced to confront a world where power and status no longer define her value, creating one of those rare touching stories where silence speaks louder than words. Through a quiet night in a remote cabin, their conversation reveals truths about control, loss, and what it really means to care for another person, shaping another layer of deeply moving, touching stories that resonate with real life. When morning comes and the female CEO's world returns with helicopters and black SUVs, the single dad remains unchanged, grounding the emotional core of this powerful entry among touching stories that highlight character over status. In the end, this is one of those touching stories that reminds us that true strength is quiet, respect cannot be bought, and sometimes the greatest impact comes from those who ask for nothing in return. If you enjoyed this, subscribe. More stories are coming.